Hey, thanks everybody for joining us again. It's I don't know, about our fourth month of doing this, and I'm excited to share more stuff about our program, what we're doing. Of course, we have Daniel Clark on the line, and we also have Larry um, Barch, and that represents Techno, and we are quite busy, and we're excited to be that. So um, today we're talking about estimating and just some notes that I have on our estimating module. And just to give you some background on that, in one of my former jobs and positions, I did estimating at two different companies. One was a uh, miscellaneous steel fabricator in Linwood, Washington, and we built all kinds of metal products and such. And so I had to do um, estimating of the jobs and project management of that. So I started out early doing estimating. Some of those jobs went from a miscellaneous bracket up to $1 million projects for highway projects. So I had to do estimating fairly early on. It was one of those detriments when you're pretty good at spreadsheets and math. You get asked to do that. And then the second one was at a precision sheet metal shop. And that was more when I started becoming involved with the um, MRP computer functionality. And so that first program that I introduced and became an expert at DBA manufacturing, they had an estimating module, and that was a requirement for us for the precision sheet metal. And so for doing precision sheet metal, we would do, that was kind of the starting point for the job. Daniel even pointed out to me before we got started today was, hey, your spreadsheet's missing, or your flow chart in the background's missing the estimating step. And because Daniel has the newer version on his screen. So from that standpoint, it's very important, especially in the job shop environment. I tried to allude to that in our email that came out, is that's kind of a lifeblood to a job shop. But it can be useful in the regular manufacturing environment as well. So it more as a costing tool or a pricing tool. So some of my conversation today will be really directed towards the contract or job shop kind of things where they do parts and projects for specific customers. So when I set out to do the estimating module, we had done it originally, and I don't know if Tim is on, one of our customers that's in Burlington, Washington, really pushed us hard to add a lot of functionality for the estimating module. And they worked in the aerospace industry. But our original program intent was cost plus pricing. So a lot of times when we're more of a distribution model, it's maybe margins and it's not as much just what the customer will think, where the estimating module is really you're putting together and compiling costs, and then you're maybe marking it up or adding additional costs to it to come up with a price. And so that's one of the basic program intents, is cost plus pricing. So what is our cost? What kind of plus do we want to add to present a price to our customer? That cost we want to define by the materials list and routing tasks. So if you're familiar with our program, we have the items, we have item numbers, we have a list of items. Typically, it is going to be a manufactured item. So if somebody says, well, I want to do an estimate for a purchased item, really that doesn't fit the model. So that could be one thing that you run into. It's like, well, you picked an item that was a purchase part. So you really are looking for this manufacturing type. It's going to be manufactured. But when we define an item in our system that's manufactured, it is made up of a bill of materials, and it is made up of a labor bill of materials. Some people call it a planner. Routing tasks. And really those are your two basic building blocks to say what is our cost going to be or what's our estimate going to be, is defining that in terms of the bills of material, what components are in the bill of material, and what labor operations are needed to to make the part for the customer. So you'll see there's a lot of similarities when we switch over to estimating because it's built off the same building blocks. What's the bill of material and what's the labor involved with that? So, um, that's going to be a common thing, and that's what we're trying to do when we looked at the intent for the program, is that it's going to be a complementation of that. I had a gentleman that schooled me early on at that second estimating job, and he said, Claire, it's all about setup costs. And I said, well, what do you mean setup costs? Well, in the variation of cost. And so he says, I want to quote on 10 parts and I want to quote on 100 parts. So that became an important component of our program design. Was we needed to make it so that you could input, let's say I want to quote or a price for quantity 1, quantity 10, quantity 100. So, and that is built off the model that we're going to take whatever the setup cost is, and we're going to make the assumption, heavily noted on that word, is that the setup time takes the same time to make one part as it does to make 10 parts, or take 1,000 parts. Now that's not always true, but that's the assumption that the system makes, is that the setup time is fixed and is quantity independent. Some people say, well, that's not true because I can only make so many in a day and I have to set up that machine once a day. Well, then I would recommend you quote do the estimate in terms of your daily quantity or something like that. But the basics of our program and the calculation that's done is that we're going to assume the time under the routing tasks for setup is fixed, and the runtime is the variable based on quantity. So we're going to divide the setup cost by the quantity. So it's okay to put in a quantity 1, quantity 10, quantity 100, and it's going to amortize or spread out that cost of setup across the quantity. So you typically will see with the quantity going up, the unit cost going down. So that was a basic fundamental thing in calculating the estimates. The next one was miscellaneous cost, or tooling, or NRE, non-recurring expense. We wanted to be able to factor that into the pricing or the quote, and so we give you a box to put that in. And then the last major principle or thing that the program is margin or markup. Some people talk margin, that's usually more the distribution folks, but some people talk markup. I want to mark that job up 25%. Well, there's the old adage, a 25% markup is a 20% margin. So there's fun with math for us geeks out there, that there is a difference between the two, and we let you choose that so it fits what model or what your type of thinking is. So a couple of things to do when we're setting up for estimating that we want to look at before you do it, some of you already have done it, is under defaults your company, and under your company it's the options tab and down to the estimating section. And so there's a section with a bunch of settings. Now you may not personally have access to this screen, maybe your administrator does, and so you can contact them and they can change these defaults for you. But think of these, they are all defaults, meaning we allow you to edit them or change them on a given estimate. So what we want to do is have starting numbers. So what's our base number? What's the low number? Or what's the typical number that we'd want to charge out the door? And so in these numbers here for default labor percentage, now these are numbers or percentages that we're going to use based upon this setup down here as in markup or margin. So in this case, it's down as markup, as that's what I used to do as when I was in estimating. But you can change it to the word margin, and then it'll calculate differently. But these percentages, and some people we went to great lengths because of Boeing and what they allow. Just because, remember, we started out in the Seattle area, and so Boeing, a large contractor, and they allow you to do certain types of markups or types of groupings of items that you can group up, like labor, material, outside processing, general and administrative, and profit. So all these, we were kind of like, sometimes people are like, that's way too many. And I said, we just mark everything up 25%. And so I say, well, put zeros in everything but the profit, put 25%. So you don't have to have a number, all of these. Just remember that they're cumulative. So the labor, material, and outside process, those are at the base level. They don't interact with each other because they're separate costs where they come from. But the G&A is a markup on top of these other margins or markups, and profit is a markup on top of all the other four. So if you put numbers in all of these, it becomes a very large number very quickly. Now, hopefully for your sake and your business, you can keep doing that. But for me, there's a limit to what we can get away with. So again, if you want it really simple, you can just boil it down to putting 25% in the profit or 40% in the profit, and the rest can be zero, because it'll still be doing that 40%. But if in turn here, if we have this to be 10%, and then this 14, now it's going to go 10%, it's going to mark it up another 10%, and then it's going to mark it up another 14% on top of that. Any questions on that? Other settings that is like expires. How many days does your quote last? And again, you can change these when you're actually in a specific estimate, whether you're going to amortize things, and do you want to use minimum buy. I'll touch on minimum buy a little bit later, but basically think of it in terms of if you have to buy a whole sheet and your inventory system is set up that it says the minimum buy is a whole sheet, then on an estimate it'll prompt you, if you're using less than a sheet, to go ahead and factor the cost for the whole sheet. So again, these you want to set up ahead of time, these settings. A couple other things to set up before we get into the estimates and using an estimate. And remember, we under our other menu, we put a lot of those initial setup things. One of them is the reasons lost or sales quote reason lost. And that one is a screen where you can put in for tracking later as to why we didn't get the job. So delivery, our experience factor, price, and Daniel laughed at this one earlier because I put in stupidity. So you can, hopefully you can just call the customer stupid sometimes. But so those are for you to track and to organize to say, hey, I want to have feedback in the system. And we allow you to do that in the estimate itself. We allow you to check whether it was won or lost. And if it's lost, then this box down here becomes active. And that's where you can choose that reason why we lost it, just because we want feedback on everything. So this is the estimate screen itself. You'll notice that it's underneath, it's under the sales menu, and it's above quotes. So we have quotes and estimates. And briefly, I wanted to touch on that. So if you use quotes, quotes are pretty much a sales order of a status quote. And you look very familiar to this. You know, it's the same screen as a sales order. It's just down here as a status quote. It's really more intended for where you're selling an existing product, something that is that it's a stock item, or you sell it to multiple customers. You can use all kinds of pricing scenarios to define, you know, what the item is. Oh, great pick, customer critical. But you can basically, it's just a pre-sales order, but it doesn't treat it as on order yet, and you can print out a form that you can send to that customer as a response to what they want. But it really is not going to calculate your cost and compare your cost to the pricing. It's more meant to set up or to use standard cost, or not standard, but pricing that you pre-established for something. So it's a little different on the quotes. For an estimate, it's back to that initial intent of it's a cost plus. For estimates, again, it's under the sales menu, second option, estimates. It's more about saying, I want to make a calculator and say, this is what I'm building, what goes into it, how much should I charge for it. So in this, we'll look at an existing one here. In the screen itself, we got this blue bar across there. That blue bar is new as of last night because I said, I need to be able to show people. So I made this a little more pronounced last night with this blue bar that goes across. Up above the blue bar is information related to the estimate. So what's the number, who's the customer, what's the contact, has it been printed or not, emailed, what's the dates. Remember how I said you could set how many days till it expires? You can see that it's so many days. Well, it's 60 days difference between this date and the expire date. Now, I could have manually gone in and changed this. Once I have it won or lost, it does lock the screen so you can't edit it. So if you're looking to how do I kind of retain the history of it, once it's won or lost, it just kind of turned it into a read-only screen. So from the standpoint of below the blue line, it's more about the item. And that is really the same information that you'd find under inventory items. And so what's the item number, description? The intent was that first you could create the item over here in estimates, and it actually gives the part number of status estimate. So I don't know if you've seen that where you're in the items screen, and it basically, one of your choices underneath the status here is estimate. And that's because if you create the item underneath the estimating screen, it will not treat it as an active part. So we're trying to categorize stuff that we just estimated to not be included in our regular inventory list until we've converted it. Again, when you pick the 1, it actually will flip that status from an estimated item into a normal status for that item. But I want to again point out that some of the data in this screen is related to the estimate, the upper section, and the lower section is the item. So in this case, if I come in here and I pick an existing item and I change the description, I'm changing the description of the item in the regular database and the regular inventory list. So that's just a point of caution. If I go to the materials tab, one advantage to the estimate, it gives you a multi-level bill of material. So you can see it gives some tree nesting level like logic here, and you can do the minus plus. You can compress or expand the bill of material to see the different items and from this standpoint. But if I edit the bill of material here, I'm editing the bill of material in the item table as well. And same is true for the task list. Like, the nice thing here is we're trying to present a lot of this information to you in the form of costing or dollars. So you'll see a lot of reference into the time. The yellow is highlighted here for us to be able to edit it, and then it does the math for the labor. One thing I forgot to mention back under the building blocks for costing is where does the cost come from for the materials and where does the cost come from the tasks? Well, the task that comes from your manufacturing other and then resources. So these are those labor rates that we put into the system, and each one can be set in here as to what is our cost per area of the shop, and it can be setup, run, or an overhead. So it's like setup, $25 plus $18 is the setup rate, or it's $22 plus $18 for $40 is our run rate labor. So these are the rates that are used in the estimating module. So if you're doing this, trying this for the first time, and you're not getting any values here for the labor under tasks, you want to go back to manufacturing other and then to resources to establish what your rates are for that labor area for your facility or shop. The materials on the other side, it's all the manufactured is really more the labor side, but the purchased items, every time we create an estimate, it creates a record and it pulls in what the standard cost is for that item. So if we're to look at that item, and you can do the right click like we do in other areas of the program, and you can look up and you come into the costing tab. We don't have a cost in here, and this is the cost that is typically used. Note I said typically used in the estimating process. So, you know, if you're going to use the estimating system widely, you need to make sure you do a good job managing your standard costs for things, because that's what it's going to default to. It can also, if it's not typical, it can use vendor costs. So on things where you have, in the system, you might have taken a particular item. I'll take this 1-inch tubing, for example, go down to the 8100 item number. We could right here done a cross-reference vendor cost. And so we could have constructed here where we put in a certain quantity, and we could put quantity breaks for this particular item. And you could have a range where it goes from 1 to, let's say, 100. So it's 1-inch tubing. It's not pipe, so we're going to go 1 to 100, and we could do another for that same item of 100 plus. It is only 85 cents per linear, let's say. And so you can have these quotes in here. These are also used when you do a purchase order. So we're trying to share that information. If you've updated and put in vendor quoted information into your system, the estimating system will use that as well. With the lack of this being here, it will defer to the standard cost. So the other thing to note that we mentioned earlier was the minimum, whereas we'll get into certain cases where we'll maybe need to define a minimum. And so we need to buy 20 feet. And so this one is one from before. And when we do a new one, it'll show you, but it would say it's 57 cents isn't enough. It needs to be a higher value because of where you have to buy 20 feet minimum. So that can be factored in as well. You can also, when we're doing a new quote, you can override the minimum cost and the unit cost. So if you just know it, you called the vendor, got a quote price or whatever, you could literally in the estimate just record what the cost is, and it'll use that cost for the material for this estimate. So let me go backwards. Any questions on the setup of doing estimating or questions about estimating so far?
Yeah, Claire, this is Nikki. I had a question about, is there a report that we can run to see perhaps which items don't have costs inputted yet?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways to attack that. One, you could literally look at the items list. So you can literally go to the items list and you can see which ones have a standard cost. You may or may not be showing that column. Maybe remember how we can customize the columns. And so sometimes people will do lesser priority on standard costs, so they may not be showing that. So that'd be your first thing is just to look at your items listing, and then maybe start with that and the filter the list to purchase items. So that's a quick way to see if standard costs have been assigned. If it's like vendor quotes and stuff like that, we could run a query for you, but there's a couple different options, but this is the basic one. Would that suffice?
I'll defer to Tom to tell us if that will suffice, but it
Okay,
looks good to me.
okay. So yeah, so that's a good thing is just to see. Now, when we're doing an estimate, that's a great thing to look for is just to see if there's a cost on each purchased item. Because if you know you're missing a cost, then the estimate can't be a good evaluation of the cost. Other persons with questions?
One note I would make is your minimum buy build, that's just a setting you can turn on or off per estimate, right?
Yes, and the actual minimum buy field is one of your MRP parameters. So that's in here that if I'm going to buy it, I got to buy 20 feet. So so that's where the value is or the quantity comes from, but you don't have to use that. That's a checkbox in the estimate. Others? So let's go through creating an estimate. So I'm going to do new. One of the functionalities that we wanted to build in was creating the part number right here in estimating. So rather than having to go over to items, create a new item and estimating, you literally can just check the box new, type the item in. You can pick an existing. This is the best thing if you're more of a standard manufacturer. If you're just doing costing internally, using the existing is a great way. Just brings up an existing part number. And then the one that I recommend the most is the copy function. And so what we would do is basically pick an item that is prior existing. And if you do this a lot, some of our customers that do a lot of estimating, they pre-built items. And sometimes the description is even like template. And one of our customers is going to have us add a checkbox for these are the template items in the near future. But literally, you can pick an item that you're going to copy from. And the beauty of that for saving time and effort is it will copy the item, it will copy the bill of material, and it will copy the routing tasks. So, and if for those types that maybe they're doing it for internally, you don't have to have a customer here if it's like for internal purposes, but typically if it's the job shop mentality, we're going to select a customer. If you predefine the customer, great. But if you haven't, you could leave it blank and then fill it in later. Remember these jump buttons is these little triangles, we call them jump buttons. If you click that, it will jump you to the customer list to make it easier to add something. So, and you can literally enter a customer that's more of a prospect and you can flag them as such to keep them out of your active customer list and use it in the estimating module. But again, typically it's maybe an existing customer and you're just quoting an additional part for them. The contact tab, so the contact tab, it's going to be the contacts from that customer. And so you can pick one of them. You don't have to use that. As Daniel just told me, we have to put a dummy customer in. I'll have to test that later. You try to hold me to that. And then you can have...
that's for quotes, not estimates. Sorry.
Yeah, hey. Quit trying to correct me on the fly. Throw me off. Salespeople, you may or may not have internal salespeople, so you don't have to use that if you do. Originally, we had that down as that was the person like creating the estimate, but later we added the prepared by box as well, just so that we could say who is doing the estimate. So you may or may not have salespeople assigned to it. So Printed, email, that's your typical fields from our program. Hey, have we printed the estimate to the customer? Have we emailed it to the customer? Those are pretty typical. This is again that use item minimum buy. That's trying to say, hey, make sure we don't get stuck buying something we don't normally buy. The completion, go ahead. Hey, Tom. So the completion date, that's important just as a tracking thing. I think we added that for one of the customers that said, hey, I need to know what the date was requested and when did we complete it. They used it for some of their quality metrics and just a way to know that it was done or not. Lead time, that's usually just a note to reference on the quote. I don't know about you, but when I was doing quoting, it was always like they wanted to know price and delivery. So is it a 4 to 6 weeks or is it 8 weeks or whatever? Reference number is typically, the RFQ number, or if they have a project name, that kind of a scenario. So again, like our standard copy functionality, it added the number, it added a dash in front of it, and it changed the description to copy of rear rack. We, of course, can edit the description right in this field. This is the part where I'm saying it's going to allow that to happen, and it's actually going to update the description in the inventory. Drawing number, we usually put that in revision just out of caution. So what drawing number did we quote it off of, what revision it was, all those kind of important pieces of information so that when it does turn into an order, we want to be able to double check things just to make sure that, hey, you had me quote revision D, but you just ordered revision E. That means we have to re-quote it, or we have to put a new estimate together to see if there was any process or material changes. Again, with all of our inventory items, we do require that inventory type. And here's a few boxes that, as somebody was using it, they said, we want to establish this up front. In your copy of the program, you may see a bunch of check boxes over here. We're in the process of migrating those to the review tab so that, so in this case, you can create whatever check boxes, just like we do for our other attributes throughout the rest of the program, so that you can specify, hey, I want to kind of do a custom field to say, did I look for this? Does it include this? And it's part of your process that we can do this. And so remember, it's one of the setup things under sales, other estimate. Yours may say estimate attributes. I just added the word review here. And so that's where you can establish what these user-defined fields are, and so that they can be added to the form. So these are really great, especially if you have to go through some quality audit stuff. Did I ask about the materials? Did I ask about this? And it's a way of making a checklist for the estimate. So item versus estimate. Remember we talked about the upper is the estimate, lower is the item. The calculation tab, that's all about the estimate. This is that intent where we said we want to be able to do multiple quantities. So I'm going to do a line for 10. I'm going to do a line for 100. And I could do multiple lines here. I could do another line for 500. So it's really up to you. For some reason, I always seem to, when I was estimating, get asked for 3 different quantities. And a lot of times it could be what they needed to prototype it, so they just needed a few pieces, and then production run, they needed to decide between whether they were going to order 100 or 500 for the economic order quantity. Now, when I bring this in, it defaulted those percentages we talked about earlier. So here's my material markup, here's my labor markup, outside, G&A, and profit. Those are all just defaulted. You have the ability to edit those during this process. So if you want to put a higher markup on a smaller quantity, that's within your ability to do that within the program. Now, typically, I put in the quantity that's requested on the quote, and then I'm going to bounce over to the materials portion, and it's going to tell me, oh, it's so much round rod that is needed for this. And I could literally edit the bill of material at this point to say, no, this one's slightly different. I need 14 linear feet or 14 each for that, for this thing. And I've now changed the bill of material for this. Again, you'll see down below when I'm on the manufactured item, it doesn't have material costing, but as soon as I change it to the purchased item, it gives me these different, the estimate quantity, the total required, and then it factors in waste on this one. So notice that we had a 10% waste, because if you multiply 10 times 14, that's 140. But if you add 10% waste, it gets it up to the 15.55. So 15.55 times quantity 10, it's saying for the quantity 10, we're going to need 155 pieces of that material. And in this case, it didn't have a unit cost, and so I literally could type in what the unit cost is for this, and I can put it in, and it starts to do the math. So you don't have to necessarily go back and do the estimate, but you could go and right-click and open the vendor and the cost and jump to that screen if you did get a quote from a vendor for that. So like typically we allow you to do the right-click and jump to or open a related form for that kind of information. So in this case, we've entered $1 each. We can also put a minimum cost, let's say on the 10, well, you know, it's got to be a $200 minimum at this point, which now it says, well, that was more than the $15, so now it's up to 20. So it's going to use that higher value there. Over on the tasks, it copied these tasks or labor operations from our template, or the one that we copied from. We could add additional functionality or additional tasks to the process in this screen. You could also use templates that are available in our system that you maybe pre-assigned or done in this standpoint, or you can just go straight and you have to assign a resource. So you have to pick something in here, and then you have the choice in the yellow is to, well, what's the setup and what's the runtime. So this is in fractions of an hour, so it's 0.1. But we give you a calculator function. So if you think in hours, minutes, seconds, you can enter it that way, or you can enter it, well, it's so many parts per hour. So if you're like, oh, it's 100 parts per hour, it's going to do the math and calculate that. Oh, I gave it a nice easy number, so it's easy calculation. So it's going to use that little calculator function with that little 3 dot, which is called an ellipse button. Same button is available over here. But it's not as in parts per hour because, again, we're thinking the setup is one setup per that process. Now, you could choose to put in, let's say, an hour of setup, and you could literally have 0 on a run hours too. So you can have 0 setup or 0 run hours, depending on what it is. Some people put in notes, and so it maybe either does not have time. So now I can go back to the calculation tab. I can right click and recalculate all. And so it's coming up with a suggested price of $85 for the quantity 10. And so it puts down a quoted price. So this one's the math the system does. Here's where you can make numbers pretty. So you can literally say, well, it's $85.99. And that's what we'll print out on the quote. So I've had people where they're just like, close enough, or I think in round dollars, it's always $43, just so I don't have to mess with it. So we allow you to edit the quoted price. And again, you can do fun with math and change particular margin markups on these different areas to impact the quoted price as we go. You can change certain ones, and you can change those independent of the item, meaning for each quantity you can have different percentages to correlate to the quantity. So the system did the math, looked at everything, and looked at your material, looked at your tasks. I know this is a simple example. The notes here, these notes are related to the estimate. So we're trying to remind you that some of it's related to the estimate and some is related to the item. Documents tab that we use throughout the program, this one's related to the item. The attributes is related to the item. So if you've got an attribute you've set up in advance, then back to what we had suggested earlier, these are related to the estimate. So now we've created our estimate. We've saved the estimate. We can say it's today. We can say it's not done today. And then we can literally right-click and do a print estimate. Just a form, just another one of our Crystal Report forms. Again, we can modify, put logos, make them pretty, that kind of thing. I would suggest that I go back in here and change them to sort ascending by quantity instead of descending. Oops, sorry about that. But this is the intent here is to make it so that you can just do a right click, send it to the customer without having to create something else. Some of the notes, some of the lead time, things like that can be shown on here as well. One additional thing that we had to come up with is if you're doing, let's say, a quote package where they give you 5 different parts to quote, you have to enter them into our estimating module as separate estimates per part number or per item number. So if you've been given a quote package for 10 items, then you're going to have 10 estimates because you're calculating those individually. But you can highlight 2 of them or more, and you could do a print merged estimate. And then when that prints, it will list both items on the estimate, both items and all their quantities, so that you can send them instead of send a separate estimate for all of them, you can send one piece of paper with multiple items on it. There's other choices that you can make here, like the print detailed calculation. One of the processes that when I did estimating, I had to print out something, take it up to my supervisor, and they would look over the numbers and tell me whether that was good or not. That's just a process double check. So this is more for internal purposes, but it gives you, the detailed information on a piece of paper to share with somebody else. There is the email estimate. It's just like emailing a quote or emailing an acknowledgement. It just brings up a box to send it out. We do give you the option if they wanted to buy it, you can do a convert to sales order. At this point, what day did they order it, what purchase order number, what quantity. Note that the quantity is fixed to the quantity that you quoted, and that's just because we need to know what price to use. If they ordered 20 instead of 10, you pick the 10 and then edit the sales order as a secondary step. And then due date is just the date the customer expects it back. On the flip side, if we did not win it, we could pick the wrong one again. By the way, when you convert it to, you're telling the system you want it. So in this case, because I went to do an example of converting it, it flagged it as 1 because I did the convert. So I'm unable to choose the lost because I already said I want it. But if you hadn't won it, you could check the lost and pick the reason. An example of that I'll share with everybody is that you can create, and we have a query of that, our custom query or custom graph is like here. We can do a win estimate rate. Daniel told me I'm supposed to copy. somewhere in the chat, put this. Okay, I'm going to mess up Daniel. I've lost it. Oh, there it is. Everyone. Send. So there's a great example of a custom query. And the way I wrote this one, it included the date range. So you could put a date range from the first month of the year to the sixth month of the year to graph out what's our won loss ratio in our quotes. So, any questions? Kind of rambled on and talked a lot today. So how many people, has anybody in this call used the estimating module so far?
I have not.
Okay. So it's one of those things, just feel free to test it, try it out. Just remember, if you do change a bill of material, it's going to change it in the item master. So a little safer to do a copy of something when you're testing it.
Okay.
And along those same lines, if you were to, edit a sub-assembly in that chain somewhere, you're editing that sub-assembly out in inventory. So some of our users choose to go make a copy, and then you can swap it out in the bill of materials or something along those lines. You can always copy an item or do existing or do new. It gives you those three choices when you launch it.
So I appreciate any feedback from people. Once you try it, we'll record this, or we have recorded this, and so we'll publish this to the blog. If somebody else in your organization hasn't used it yet, just give us some feedback. Again, you can use things like the attributes and reviews or review tab to add custom fields to make it fit your process. But if you do any job shop type work, it is a very handy tool and a great place to start where you use our program. One last chance for questions. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your day and joining us. Again, I think next month it'll maybe purchasing, I think is what we're going to talk about, but we'll publish that. So thanks everybody for joining us today.
All right. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Claire.
Daniel.
You're welcome.
Thank you, guys.